Hey, I'm Brian, and this is a Cel. It comes in different sizes and sometimes materials, but from the 1930s to the end of the 90s, this was the standard way of making animation. Every frame, a literal painting. I think most people who are into comics, cartoons, anime would know what a cel is, or so I thought. I recently did a convention and was a bit shocked at how often I had to explain what a cel was. Most people thought I was showing prints on clear acrylic, so I decided to rewrite the narration of this video to do an introduction on cel animation as well as how I ended up cel painting. I don't think you should look at this as the definitive history of cel painting and cel animation, but just rather as an introduction. Invented by Earl Hurd and John Randolph Bray in 1914, a cel is usually a clear acetate sheet which has line art on one side and paint on the other. I always loved the quote by Disney animator Floyd Norman about the early days of animation. Back in those days, animated films were made by hand, no technology. It was a handmade product. The evolution of cel painting and cel animation is as wild as the images it produced. At one point, the process was backwards. The characters were animated on the paper behind the cel, and the backgrounds were painted on the cel on top, probably because the cels were so expensive and hard to come by, but the byproduct meant the characters could never leave the center of the frame. Fleischmann Studios patented and created a rotoscoping technique, a process still used in modern animation and filmmaking. Ralph Bakshi would take this concept and further perfect it in Fire and Ice. Disney created the multi-plane camera that allowed for complex camera movements in animation. And the paints evolved as well, originally starting as a gouache type paint until cel vinyl paints were developed. And in Japan, the boundaries were being pushed as well. Mattes and complex camera exposures in Akira still leave the animation community divided on how it was done. SFX, or special effects, was created and refined in the animation department. An early type of airbrushing was used to create the wings on Tinkerbell. And the best thing about cel animation is that it allows for collaboration in mixed media. Animated characters and live actors. St. James Infirmary, Mary Poppins, Cool Worlds, Roger Rabbit, to name a few. Live actors with animated actors. How amazing is that? As seen on this channel, the Lone Ranger used collage for their backdrops. Animes use edited photographs as backgrounds, something I do with my current painted cels. And Studio Ghibli's stunning Knicker poster paint backgrounds are something to behold. The ability to use cels with other media is something I still try to do on this channel, combining LEDs for lightsabers, using screen tones for shadows. But even in a more modern context, CGI and 2D digital can still be seamlessly merged with cel painting, as seen in the 1986 film The Great Mouse Detective. To me, cels are the last tangible element of a creative process. It's historical. The final painting, not a copy, the actual frame realized. What we see on screen is the actual reproduction. The cel is the real thing. And the odd thing is, for many years, they were a disposable byproduct. Early on, studios would wash cels to reuse them to keep costs down. Keeping costs down will be a running theme in this video. Entire shows were disregarded, tossed in the garbage to save on storage costs, and unfortunately, they do degrade over time. Disney used to have an entire department called the Ink and Paint Department, where cels were first inked, which involved taking the original line art and hand transferring it onto a cel, and then flipped around and painted. And this was very much a collaborative process. The original cel painters added character. They took liberties and chances. There are all sorts of stories of the ink and paint department going that extra mile, adding colored line art, adding shadows, taking liberties by adding makeup to Snow White, changing the face of her altogether forever. And despite its rich history of collaboration, the ink and paint department never really took center stage. They always took a backseat to the animators, even though there was a good argument to be made that they were the backbone of cel animation. And much like inkers and colorists in comic books, they probably never got the respect or attention they deserved. And probably for that reason, as years went on, the ink and paint department was constantly fighting against technology. In 1961, 101 Dalmatians became the first fully Xerox copied film. Hand inking the frame had been replaced by a photocopier, and it was noticed. Gone were colored outlines, replaced by sketchy thin black outlines, inconsistent and not necessarily as polished, but it was a cost and time saver. In an interview with Chuck Jones by Michael Barrier and Bill Spicer, Jones would state, "I would say it helped Disney tremendously. They were able to bring in 101 Dalmatians for about half of what it would have cost if they had to animate all those dogs and all those spots. It wouldn't be long before studios realized they could send the painting process overseas. It wasn't an instantaneous switch. At first, it was mostly animated cartoons and made-for-TV movies, stuff designed to sell action figures and toys. Disney kept painting their marquee feature films, their major films, in Burbank until The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid in 1989 would be the last Disney cel-painted film. Afterwards, they'd be replaced by the revolutionary cap system, the first nail in the coffin of cel animation. And I'm sure the Disney cel painters from the nunnery would have turned their noses in disgust. The idea of ink and paint not being done in-house, but unfortunately the cap's digital animation system was too tempting to resist. But as I said, it wasn't an immediate switch. Maybe because it was more cost-effective, a lot of cartoons were still cel animated until the 2000s. In the 90s, you could have been mistaken to thinking cel animation was thriving. By exporting the paint process overseas, the studios got their cost savings. And there was amazing animation being made. Warner Brothers were creating classics like Batman, Tiny Toons, Animaniacs. Fox was making The Simpsons, X-Men, The Tick, all while this digital threat loomed in the background. But eventually computers became too cheap or maybe too consistent to ignore. And slowly, the animation started to change from paint to digital. King of the Hill in 2004. SpongeBob 1999, and if you wanted a clear sign the end was near, The Simpsons switched in 2002. Anime, being a whole different beast and a whole different world, was defiant as always. The last holdout was Sazae-san, switching in 2013. I interestingly had the conversation multiple times at the convention, when was the peak of cel animation? And that's a bit of a loaded question, because I don't overly think that the product became obsolete. A well-made cel-animated show or movie still holds up next to a digitally animated movie. It just became too costly to continue, at least in terms of labor or certain aesthetics. The failures of Titan AE and Iron Giant in the box office certainly helped play into the studio's mind that everything had to be 3D animated and do that Pixar look. There can be this misconception that cel animation looks poor, but I think a lot of that comes from examining shows that were designed to be on low-resolution TVs or low-budget shows, and also poor transfers. But if something was shot on 35mm, it holds up. And in terms of animation quality, that has little to do with the digital or painted, and more to do with how long the animators were given to animate. Look at Princess Mononoke, Perfect Blue. If they were released in theaters today, they'd still be relevant. It's important to remember when looking back on cel animation, they were always designed to be made as cheap as possible. Sure, occasional episodes of the 90s X-Men looked a little bit janky, but look at the new season of One Punch Man. It has less to do with the medium and more to do with time. In terms of when the tech peaked, I kind of look at that as when digital started to take over. As someone who is constantly looking for and buying old animation equipment, most of the equipment that isn't a digital shortcut, like a scanner is kind of a shortcut for a camera, seemed to be made in the 60s and 70s. I think by the 80s, the tech had reached its height. And at that point, it increasingly became more and more digital. I think to understand the history of cel painting, it's important to understand why it disappeared. Technology and money. They call it the movie industry for a reason. It's a fine balance between art and commerce. It requires a tremendous amount of work to animate. And in order for studios to justify making it, there has to be a tremendous financial reward. And for most of the history of animation, labor was the most expensive cost in animation. And I'm willing to bet it still is. And in my opinion, technology has always been the producer's way of innovating, but also keeping costs down as much as possible. And cel painting is an incredibly laborious and intensive process. It takes me several hours to paint one. I'd be lucky if I could paint 1 second of animation in a week. So by switching from paint to digital, you might spend more on computers, but you're saving on entire teams of painters. And because most of the ink and paint had been outsourced overseas, it became less of a collaboration, and it became more about consistency and quality control. Maybe that's why there's such a contrast between how Disney viewed the ink and paint department in the early years versus how the Simpsons think of the ink and paint department. And maybe because it was shipped abroad, ink and paint never really had that star energy. Most people who are interested in animation can name directors, animators, voice actors, but I'd be surprised if they could name one cel painter. I spend a lot of time in the world of cel animation, and I only can name a few off the top of my head, such as Joyce Carlson, Beth Ann, David Martinez. The truth is, cel painting has never really had that lead singer energy. For lack of better metaphor, cel painters are the basis of the animation world. Most artists probably had dreams of animating or creating characters and probably viewed ink and paint as a starting point, a way of getting their foot in the door before moving on to better things, which is probably why when the studios started to outsource the painting process, it was met with little pushback. And for the studios, labor was cheaper. It was a giant cost savings to go to Korea, Japan, China, even Canada. The studios looked at this as a strategic move, thinking that the amount they saved could be used on new technology, revenue, cost savings, and they never really thought about what they would lose. But I don't want to undersell the amazing work the overseas studios and painters did. Many of my favorite animated shows were painted in Korea, and in fact, Korea ended up being a hub of source for animation. Most of my animation just comes from Korea. We also can't forget the digital component to this, because it's eerily similar to what's happening in the animation world now, with one giant exception. When the CAP system and digital and 2D and 3D animation began to dominate the world, a lot of the artists had areas to pivot, and an argument could be made that there was actually room to grow. New tools, but similar process. I mean, I can't help but think layers and transparencies and all these Photoshop tools are directly inspired by the cel animation process. But here's a giant exception. Probably the biggest threat to all artists is AI, because I don't really see it as an option to pivot. I see it as taking away jobs and not allowing more jobs to be created. It is a reverse funnel. And it's heartbreaking to see talented animators who have dedicated their lives looking for new careers, going onto forums and saying, where are my skills applicable? But I think there's hope that once the initial excitement of AI dies down, we will be able to sit back and decide what kind of animation do we want. So that leads to why I cel paint. I'm not a painter by trade. I don't have any formal education on painting, and I'm definitely not an illustrator or animator. I fell into cel painting because I started as, and I still am, a cel collector who was overly curious and went down this rabbit hole, and I couldn't believe that cels were being forgotten. To me, animation cels are history, and I think it's only fair that if I'm collecting history, I should do my part to preserve it. But my timing was terrible. I think I first started researching just as Cel Vinyl Paint's closed up shop. They were the main cel paint company at that time. But rather than be discouraged, I think it kind of motivated me to get on this before it was forgotten altogether. I think it's kind of crazy that I'm actually one of the few people who still cel paints, and I felt like it deserved a permanent channel rather than the occasional one-off video. I'm passionate about cel painting, from collecting to making, and because cel painting is such a versatile creative medium, it allows my inner tinkerer to combine it with other talents and interests, such as photography, creating a cel painting using fiber optics and LEDs, screen tones, even this channel, going to conventions and trying to encourage others to get into cel painting. Cel painting is such a wonderful medium to get lost in, and I hope to create more cel paintings. I hope to keep the history alive and find new ways and new techniques. I want to make animations and collaborate, and just do my part to keep this medium alive. At the convention, I had a really fun encounter with a fellow artist who seemed to be confused as to why I only want to cel paint. They didn't see why I'd want to work in such a dead medium. And to be fair, I don't completely disagree, especially in the context that we were talking about collaborating, and that I really didn't care if I drew anything. It reminded me of that tracing scene from Chasing Amy.
I ain't kidding, I'm also the colorist. The guy next to me draws it, but we both came up with the characters. Next.
So basically, you just trace.
It's not tracing, all right? I add depth and shading to give the image more definition. Only then does the drawing truly take shape.
But I look at cel painting and I see endless choices. One of the reasons why I enjoy doing these pocket tunes is because I can make the choice without doing a full painting. Look at the difference with Zoidberg just by changing the line width, or Rebecca from Edge Runners. I decided to do two very different approaches to shadows, one color-based and one black. With Link, I decided to do messy line art, and with Vader, messy color application. When you're in charge of ink and paint, your choices are endless. And if anyone's wondering what I do with these Pocket Toons when I'm done with them, I turn them into keychains. I'm not going to pretend I don't enjoy digital animation or CG animation, or that the best animation was in the past. Modern animation can still be amazing, and it still interests me. That's why I do so many Cel conversions. Into the Spider-Verse is one of my favorite movies, and Boy and the Heron is a digitally colored masterpiece. And since I started this channel, shows like Cyberpunk Edge Runners and Blue Eye Samurais have been released, and they've pushed animation narratively and stylistically to new levels. Let's not even get started on the amazing animation in video games. But I truly think cel animation still has a place, and that it's more than history worth remembering, but worth doing. Do I ever think it'll be the dominant form of animation? Of course not. But maybe, now as we get closer to AI animation on demand, maybe we'll start to revisit why we animate to begin with, and why we make art. And maybe once we find out why, we will realize a collaborative handmade product still has a place. Thanks for watching. I'm Brian, and this is Vinyl Paints.